Okay, listen, this is a total nerd alert right here. I don't go to therapy right now, so whenever I want to talk about something, what comes to mind is making a video. It's kind of like a diary entry I can speak out loud and not somebody that I know directly. So for the past 2 weeks, I have been enraptured by a podcast. It's a show called The Adventure Zone. It's made by Justin, Travis, and Griffin McElroy, who you might know from their flagship show, My Brother and Me, and a bunch of other internet stuff. So here's, you get your nerd sirens ready. It's a D&D podcast. They play Dungeons and Dragons with their dad. I understand how this sounds. And let me preface by saying, I am not one for high fantasy, and so the idea of D&D never remotely appealed to me at all. I never knew anything about it before this podcast. Like, I have a hard time getting into Game of Thrones because I'm just kind of irrationally off-put by high fantasy. But what this podcast did blew my mind. I got through the main arc, which is like their season 1, which they call the balance arc, in a solid 2 weeks. I started it on a whim and I kept going because they made me laugh, but as I continued, I quickened my listening pace. I started getting excited every time I had to leave my friends and get back in the car, and by last week, I was plugging my headphones in the moment I woke up in the morning and taking them out right before I fell asleep. By Monday of this week, I was on the last chunk of balance. I walked downtown to a cafe with my earbuds in, my jaw on the ground the whole way. At a few moments, tears formed in my eyes in public, and I didn't feel like restraining the reactions I was having. I went grocery shopping and I stopped in the middle of an aisle, listening and staring straight ahead, smiling because I was so delighted by a turn the story had taken. I have to say, I was surprised. And not just by the fact that these guys could do this, but I was surprised how it made me feel. The story these guys told reminded me how it feels to fall so in love with a piece of fiction in such a way that I think about it the moment I wake up until the moment I go to sleep. In the past couple of years, I've read books, I've watched TV shows, I've gotten really into musicals, but I haven't loved something like this since I was in high school. So this is not just a parade for the McElroys. This is what I wanted to talk about. When I was in high school, I was a Tumblr fangirl. Oh yes, it is how I spent all my time getting into TV shows and other stuff and consuming endless amounts of fan-generated content and loving fictional people and worlds so deeply that I fantasized about them tumbling into my mundane suburban existence and telling me that I was as special as they are. Then I went to college, and it stopped. Soon I realized that when other people talked about stuff that they were into like this, it sounded weird to me. It didn't excite me that they were excited. I started to grow spite for people who were into things as much as I once was. I think part of me saw that as who I was when I was younger, and I needed to be better than that, more mature, more rooted in reality. I felt like if I wanted to grow up, I had to leave those things behind. So no matter how many things I consumed and enjoyed greatly, I never truly fell in love with a story again. Not like I used to. There are some things that I loved that I now completely write off and try my absolute best to distance myself from them. I don't even want people to know I once loved them so much. This past summer, a friend was telling me that I needed to give the recent seasons of Doctor Who a chance. I told him that I would probably never watch it again. When he asked why, I gave him my humorous stock response that I'd kind of formulated for these kinds of questions. I'd say, I can't be that bitch anymore. Soon, that bitch came to refer to the person I once was when I was obsessed with things. The version of me that loved and knew way too much about all of those nerdy things that I loved. And I actually really liked looking at that version of me as that bitch. It resolved that I was definitely not her anymore, and that I am on my way to growing up, but I do have my feet on the ground. But it also gave me the liberty to let her come out just a bit every now and then, because I could treat that bitch like the Hyde to my Jekyll. So I've gotten through most of my Bim Bam because it's easy to listen to while you're doing other things. You don't need to hear every joke. I kind of back-listened as much as I wanted to for that show. I had a day where I had to drive a collective 4 hours for a work event, and out of nowhere I had the desire to give The Adventure Zone a shot. I popped on the first episode, which I had in fact listened to a while ago, and I just gave it an honest chance. The balance arc of The Adventure Zone is split into 9 or so mini arcs. It starts out the way you think it would, a couple of funny boys playing characters and doing goofs. Looking back, I don't really know at what point I got hooked. I think it might have been the moment the first arc ended and transitioned into the second. It became incredibly apparent that Griffin had done more story planning than I originally thought. It took a turn that I genuinely didn't expect, which is something difficult enough to find in media these days. It was just fun to listen to as it went on, and about halfway through Balance, Griffin started to drop hints that there is something so wildly large at play, that there was something massive that these characters were headed towards. I would often stop and think, is this really the McElroys? Suddenly this podcast was something no one knew it could be, I think. Not the listeners, not the creators. The McElroys actually explain it as a car that suddenly started flying, and you look at it like, oh, I didn't know it could do that. If you know them from their other content, then there's no world in which you think these chucklefucks could make a genuine human story about conflict and sorrow and love and friendship and trust and the choice to live for joy. It sneaks up on you, and my love for this story really snuck up on me. It was a love that was unlike anything I'd felt in a very long time, probably a solid 5 years. I had this spark to make this video because I finished all of the content they made, all of the mini arcs that they did after they tied up Balance, and I decided that all I really wanted to do was go back and listen to Balance from the start, to hear it all again knowing what I know now, to feel what I felt one more time. And I had a moment today, this was today, where I thought, is this what addiction feels like? I'm using this thing to create feelings that I forgot I could have, that I don't feel capable of creating myself necessarily. I want to keep the high it provided me. Obviously, I think a lot of people might think it's ridiculous to be addicted to a podcast, and I think that's ridiculous too. I don't think that's necessarily what it is. But something rings true about it. If anyone understands the psychology of loving creative works, and I would love to hear what you think about this. I've recognized that the Balance arc gave me something back that I hadn't had in a long time. I felt like that bitch again. Obviously, I'm a slightly more mature version of that bitch, but she had a passion that I lost because I succumbed to the voices that tell you it's weird to be so into something that you just want to tell everyone you pass on the street about it. And there is a significant difference from when I was obsessed with things when I was younger. I used to lie in bed and imagine scenarios where characters I loved stepped into my world and wanted to protect me and wanted me to help them. I wanted someone else to tell me that my life was interesting. I got older and I became very cognizant of the fact that no one else does that for you. And I could fantasize all I want, but I have to make my own life interesting. I am the only person that can make my life one worth living. So why can't I leave my feet planted on the ground? And sometimes, when the wind is just right, just fly that bitch like a kite. Of course, I might want to come up with a less offensive term for that part of me. Or just not name it at all, just come to terms with the fact that she is a part of me, not necessarily a worse version of me. I actually am going to take a stab at re-listening to the Balance arc, which is a big thing because I don't reread, I don't re-listen, I don't re-watch. As excited as I am to see what they do with Season 2 of The Adventure Zone, which they just announced today, that was very exciting. I'm not quite sure anything will ever match up to the love that I had for Balance. It was founded on and constantly supported by the surprise of how much I loved it. Now I know they're capable of creating something beautiful, and I'll be expecting something beautiful. I started the first episode all over again, and even just the theme music for the Balance arc filled me with an immense amount of joy. I was out in public and I can't stop the smile from spreading across my face, and I feel it in the pit of my stomach every time I think about it, and it feels great. On their final Q&A episode, where they answered questions after tying up the entire Balance arc, their dad, Clint, said something that has really stuck with me. He said that their mother's fingerprints were all over this show, because her way of living life was to choose joy, and that's reflected in a lot of the choices that characters make in the show and the way they react to situations and the threat that is imposed by the main conflict. And I think I'm allowed to adhere to that by letting this part of me flourish again. I hope that sometime soon I find something else that puts me in that sunny, windy day that's perfect for flying kites.